This is going to be fun tonight, I can promise you. Sparks are going to fly. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Kennedy School, the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School. Together we welcome you this evening. We have several sponsoring organizations. I'm going to read their names in just a moment. My name, by the way, is David Pryor, and I have the great opportunity of being director of the Institute of Politics, and best job in the world, so thank you very much. As you know here, those of you who have come to the forum, we love to talk politics here. That's what it's all about. Sometimes it gets a little tight, a little contentious. Add in race and politics, put them in a mix, and it gets even more challenging. But here at the Institute of Politics, we do not shy away from challenging topics. Race and politics has become a national issue, thanks in large part to the changing American electorate. As evident by the recent mayoral elections in Los Angeles, New York City, Houston, minority voters are a force, a real force in local, state, and national races. We have the high privilege tonight to host four of this country's foremost experts on politics and race, all of whom happen to be friends of the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government. Matthew Dowd, we're going to talk about all of these people in a little more detail in just a moment. Donna Brazile, Lionel Socha. Donna and Lionel were fellows here recently at the Institute of Politics. And of course, the well-known and famous Professor Lani Guenir. You can clap for all these people if you like to. Thank you. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I would like to recognize three Harvard students who came to us with the idea for tonight's event. Michael Rosado, where is Michael? Michael, thank you very much. Gerald McGarry, where is Gerald? Thank you, Gerald, thank you. I didn't do too well with those names, but I can do all right with this one. Fred Smith, where's Fred? Hey, Fred. Hey. Well, we want to thank all of you. That's what makes this place go around. You come with us with the ideas. You tell us what kind of programs you want in the forum. You tell us the speakers, and we will do our best to try to accommodate your wishes. We want to thank the organizations and the students of these following groups tonight. The Harvard Black Student Association, the Latino, how do you pronounce that? I did pretty well. Harvard Republican Club, Harvard College Democrats, KSG Latino Caucus, KSG Black Caucus, and the Kennedy School of Government Democrat and Republican caucuses. Let's give a big hand to all those great groups. Professor Zav Briggs, as he wants us to call him, Zav, that's their name for our great moderator tonight. He is a member of the faculty of the Kennedy School since 1996. He specializes in urban policy and social inequality. He has spent 2 years as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the Department of Housing and Urban Development at HUD in Washington. He advised the White House, the Congress, local leaders on regional problems, solving smart growth and affordable housing and community development issues. When he's not here moderating the forums at night in the Kennedy School of Government, he teaches. He is a percussionist. He is a poet. He loves Brazilian music. And above all, he's excited about being here tonight. Let's welcome Professor Briggs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, very much, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to you all. David, I've got your back. It's pronounced fuerza, with a ring on the end. I want to underline David's thank you to the student groups tonight, not only because the learning they do through these events is an important part of our mission as a school, but because our students teach us important things about these issues all the time. Harvard is one of many institutions in America that has a great deal to learn about these issues. And so I thank our students for teaching us things and for their patience with us as we learn. The title tonight, The Changing Dynamics of Black and Latino Politics, strongly implies that there is some important change happening in America. I think the real opportunity tonight may be in identifying what's changing and what's not. And what about our history we continue to struggle with, and what new opportunities may be on the horizon or even upon us. Thanks in part to the latest census, we know that the who of America is changing, and changing especially fast in some parts of the country, but it isn't always so clear what that change means for political voice and political outcomes, our central focus tonight, or for the other big domains that define our public and our private lives. I'm thinking of things like economic access and cultural presence and more. Recently, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and other major media have paid renewed attention to what it means to be a minority, quote unquote, in America, whether the term has any reliable meaning, especially in California and other places that are so-called majority minority. Now, our guests tonight run the gamut, from grassroots organizer and campaign manager to political pollster to legal scholar, an activist and marketing expert, and I'm pretty sure that's just Lani Guenir. I'm gonna have to check. Seriously, each of our guests has worn a number of these hats at various points in time. They've thought hard and they've worked hard on these questions, and we're very lucky to have them, and I'm deeply honored to be your moderator. There is at least one temptation, however, that we should resist tonight. It's a tendency we see too often, it seems to me, in the public debate on these issues, and that is the tendency to turn any one of our guests into the spokesperson for an entire ethnic group or political party or social perspective. Let's not do it. In the end, we sacrifice our own learning and we deny others their due when we appoint and label in that way. The spirit of this, then, is to listen and learn from the widest array of opinions, to question our own assumptions where need be, and to pay special attention, it seems to me, to those opinions that may be hardest for us to hear. Before I introduce our first guest, it wouldn't be the Kennedy School if I failed to do a little justice to the data, or as USA Today would put it, if I failed to give you a factoid or two. The Black and Latino communities are, at this special point in our nation's history, almost identical, almost equal in size, about 35 million each. But you have to take that raw number and qualify it in a number of ways. Observation number one, Latinos are the much faster growing group, 13 million increase since 1990 versus 6 million for Black America, a rate of 58% versus 21%. Immigration, the second great wave in American history, is, as many of you know, driving that big differential. Observation number two, people numbers, and I know we'll hear a lot about this from these terrific experts and veteran organizers. People numbers don't always translate into votes or voice or political power. The history of barriers faced by Black Americans is particularly well known and serious in this regard. Latinos, too, have faced many barriers. Moreover, many are non-citizens and therefore have no vote. Many Blacks and Latinos beyond that are too young to vote. For now, these two groups are also neck and neck in terms of voting age population. If I have the number right, it's about 23 million for each of these groups. Observation number three, and here's my final factoid. The national numbers aside, what matters for politics has something to do with where people of color are concentrated, whether they are mobilized in those particular places, how they relate their agendas to one another and to other groups. I know we'll hear a lot from the panel on these issues. So without further ado, I want to introduce Matthew Dodd. Matthew is chief pollster to President George W. Bush. He also serves as a senior political strategist at the Republican National Committee. During the 2000 election, he was director of polling and media planning for the Bush-Cheney 2000 team. He was once a Democratic consultant and staffer to Congressman Lloyd Bentsen. He's moved on over to the other side. He is now the GOP's top pulse taker of the nation's views on political issues, particularly the tendencies of minority voters. And he's just joined us from Austin, Texas. Just got off the plane. Matthew, thanks for being here.
No problem. Thank you. It's always interesting every time I hear the introduction, because a lot of the times they say leading Republican consultant, and I want to keep correcting and say latest Republican consultant, most recent. He's right. President Bush is the first Republican I had ever worked for, and a lot of it was a personal relationship that you all may have questions about later on, that developed, that happened a lot with the president, with a lot of people that worked for him. But I am now doing a lot of analysis and stuff for the Republican Party and candidates that I wanted to go over in sort of bullet form, some things that you probably are aware of, but also some facts and direction that the data probably is pointing to that you may not be aware of, that has not really been focused on by the media nor by anybody else, of what's actually happening in electoral politics focused on minorities. You saw the results of the 2000 election. The president got 9% of the African-American vote, 35% of the Hispanic vote. The African-American vote was about average for what Republican presidential candidates get. The Hispanic vote was way above average. It's the second highest percentage that a Republican had gotten, second to Reagan's landslide. But the difference is the president got of it a much bigger pie. When Reagan got a higher percentage, there was only 2% of all votes cast were Hispanic. In this election, 7% were Hispanic. And a lot of people still say, well, that's a number. You have to think that in 16 years, that's a 350% increase of the impact Hispanics have on the vote. It's a tremendous change, and it's a tremendous change in the states, in specific states, from Texas to Nevada, to Colorado to California. But it's also in states a lot of people don't think of, Nebraska. People don't realize 1 of every 8 children born now in Nebraska are Hispanic. 1 of every 9 in North Carolina are Hispanic. So it's a population that is going to dramatically change a lot of states. Florida. A lot of people ask what happened in Florida. Why was Florida the way it was? It's normally a lean Republican state. I'll tell you what happened in Florida was that 2 of every 3 Hispanic votes when the president's father won it overwhelmingly in '88 were Cuban American. This time, 12 years later, 2 of every 3 Hispanic votes in Florida were non-Cuban votes. And it wasn't because the Cuban population shrank, it's because the non-Cuban population grew tremendously, and not in areas like Miami, but in areas like Orlando and Tampa, St. Pete, and the inland areas that a lot of people didn't focus on. And Florida now is a state that has moved, like some other states, because of the minority growth population, black in some northeastern states and some midwestern states, Hispanic in some southern and western states, that have moved from the Republican column to the more towards the Democratic column or swing column. It's the reason why California is now much more of a reliably Democratic state. It's why New York, because of the black and Hispanic population, is now a Democratic state. It's why New Jersey, which used to be an indicator state, is why New Jersey is now a more Democratic state. It's why Delaware, which used to be as Delaware goes, so goes the nation, is now a Democratic state. There's a lot. It's why Arizona, probably in the next 4 or 6 years, will be a swing state. It's why Colorado, which was a Republican state, will now be a swing state. It's why Texas, my guess is Texas, which has always been, for the last 10 years, the state Democrats could have had a hard time winning, and every office holder that's now in Texas is a Republican. It's why Texas will probably be in the next 6 to 8 years a swing state again, and it's because primarily of the Hispanic population. Interestingly, as was alluded to, the Hispanics have a tendency because, for a lot of reasons, being underrepresented of what they are in the population. They represent about 11% of the population, but only about 7% of the vote. That's going to change. It's going to change population-wise, but it's going to change as registration and vote increases. What does that mean for Republican candidates, and what does that mean for a president running for re-election in 2004? It means that if President Bush got the exact same percentages he got last time, in 2000, he got the same percentage of the white vote, same percentage of the Hispanic vote, and same percentage of the black vote. If he got those same exact percentages, he'd lose by over 3 million votes. He would lose by 3 million. This is going to go on all night.
Quiet commentary.
Donna, who I know very well, who actually worked for Dukakis, and I worked for Benson when Benson got picked, worked together.
But he sold out.
No. I saw the light.
Oh. He got in a shorter line. Sorry.
So, no, that's fine. But what do all these things mean? The suburbs. People have pointed out the suburbs. Why are they less reliably Republican? What's going on? A lot of people have tried to point to issues. Well, it's because the Republicans don't stand for the right thing on X, Y, and Z. You know the number one reason why the suburbs are now more swing and less Republican? It's because of movement like whites 20 years ago of minority voters, Hispanics and blacks, that have gained on the economic ladder, have moved from inner cities to suburban counties. That's exactly what happened 20 years ago or 25 years ago by whites. The same thing is happening among minority voters. They're moving into the suburbs. The percentage of minorities in the suburbs has doubled in 10 years in the suburbs. So it's not an inner city population that a lot of people sort of think of inner city. It's now becoming a suburban population. So 3 million votes, what's going to happen? I mean, we'd lose by 3 million. What's there to do? There's a couple of good signs on the wall. The first is, speaking of the president got in his first election for governor, got 9% of the black vote, what he got this time, and he got 24% of the Hispanic vote. In '98, when he ran for re-election 4 years later, he got 18% of the black vote and 48% of the Hispanic vote. And so what that shows is that as minority voters have sort of heard, seen, you know, as he's talked to them and expressed things, talked about issues, he's been able to increase that percentage. Will that happen this time? Will he get 48% of the vote in 2004? That's highly unlikely. Will he get 18% of the black vote? Highly unlikely. But the likelihood that he's going to increase is tremendous among both those groups from what past history is. That's one thing. The second thing that people have not focused on as regards Latinos is that as Latinos move up the economic ladder, they have a tendency to vote more like Anglo or white voters. That's not true of African Americans. As African Americans at low income levels, middle income levels, or upper income levels roughly stay the same on what their vote is, Democrat versus Republican. There's a slight change, but it's roughly the same. So no matter if you earn $100,000 as an African American voter or $20,000 as an African American voter, you vote roughly the same. That is not true of Latinos. And it's very similar to what happened in the early part of the 1900s with European population shifts. As Europeans came here, the immigration, they were voted reliably Democratic. As they moved up the economic ladder, they became more swing. The same thing, I think, is going to happen among Latinos. I think Latinos are probably the newest, and if some of you saw an article I wrote for a magazine, the newest key swing group that's probably going to be focused on for the next 10 years. I think they're like soccer moms of the 90s, and they're like Reagan Democrats of the 80s, and the Southern strategy that Nixon talked about in the 60s and 70s of the Southern white vote. I think Latino is going to be the new soccer mom of the 2000 elections, 2000 to 2010. I think that is a very good sign for politics. Why? Because every other swing group that's ever been discussed, focused on by pundits, consultants, and all that, has been a white group. It's been heterogeneous white group. And so I think it's good, actually, for politics that we now have a group that's going to be focused on by consultants, by media advisors, by all these people, by candidates in a direct way that's non-white. It means there's concerns, they're going to talk to them more readily, they're going to devote resources to them, they're going to talk about issues related to them. So it's very good news. The other interesting thing about, and I'll finish up and we're going to take questions, the other interesting thing about minority populations is the link that exists between minority populations and unions. People don't realize that as minority populations grow, so does union populations, which influences politics. 45% of Hispanic voters in California belong to a union household. 45% of Hispanic voters. 45% of Hispanic voters in Nevada belong to a union household. 1 of every 2 African Americans in Michigan is in a union household. And so when people talk about minority politics and try to separate the two, you cannot talk about and deal with minority politics without also talking about and dealing with union issues. Because the fastest growing unions, as Donna certainly knows, the fastest growing unions in this country are not the old traditional white manufacturer unions. They're the new Latino or African American unions that are dominated by service employees or government workers or whatever else. Those are the fastest growing unions in this country, and that's going to change the nature of Democrats, how Democrats deal with politics, I think. But it's also going to have to change how Republicans deal with union issues, because you can't just deal with minorities and not deal with union issues. And with that, there's a whole bunch of other stuff I was going to say. I'll cut it short and let go of the next one.
Thank you, Matthew, very much. It's my pleasure next, everyone, to introduce Donna Brazile. Donna, in a couple of minutes before we came on, warned me that she wasn't, as she put it, used to preaching from the seated position. Somehow I think she'll overcome. Donna is a well-known Democratic field operative and a grassroots organizer. She's a native of Louisiana. She first came to national attention when Coretta Scott King asked her to serve as the National Student Coordinator for the Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday Committee, and later as the National Mobilization Director for the 20th anniversary of the historic March on Washington in 1963, which gave us the I Have a Dream speech. Donna has worked on several understates the matter, millions of senatorial, congressional, and statewide campaigns throughout her career. She's worked on every Democratic presidential campaign since she was born.
That makes sense.
In diapers she was organizing. Most recently, she made it to the top of her business serving as campaign manager, as you all know, to Al Gore in 2000, where she was credited, among other things, with organizing a tremendous field and political operation and an enormous turnout of voters of color. She was also a fellow here at the Institute of Politics last spring. We're pleased to welcome her back. Donna, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Good. It's good to be back. It took 9 months for the school to bring me back, and I don't know about you all, but I haven't given birth to anything. I have some new ideas that will help make sure that Democrats and not only retain control of the Senate, but take back the House in 266 days. So, I mean,
It's good to have a dream.
well, well, after that nightmare of Florida, I'm glad I'm back dreaming again, because I tell you. ¿Cómo estás? Hola and gracias for the wonderful introduction. Yo estudio en español at the University de LSU. Me habla español muy poco. Don't try it on anything other than some of my expressive language stuff.
Muy bien.
Muy bien, sí, sir. It is really good to be back and to be at a place that gave me so much hope last year as I recovered from not just 2 years on the presidential campaign trail, but also, for me, 32 years on the campaign trail. I'm one of those people that started early. I got up at the age of 9 years old and got involved in my first campaign, door-to-door, city council, and I went nonstop until Florida. And so I came here one wintry day last February, and many of you who not only attended my little study group, but some of my friends here, the interns and others who worked on the Gore-Lieberman campaign, you not only renewed my spirit, but also gave me my second win, and I appreciate that, and I'm glad to be back. Although this is Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday in my hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana, it's good to have the good times roll right here in Cambridge, so I'm glad to be here. This topic is very near to my heart because anytime you talk about the changing dynamics of black Latino politics, you know, it really stirs me up because there's a lot of change that needs to take place. I mean, since 1776, I mean, I know many of us can only see the world from the last 20 years, but look, from 1776 until the present day, and I'm gonna give you a little factoid, I'll be a little Kenny school person. There's been 1,864 Americans who've served in the United States Senate. Guess how many of them have been minorities? Yes, 15. 15. Since 1776, over 2,200 Americans have served as governors. 9. 9 have been minorities. 4 Hispanics, 3 Asian Americans, 1 African American, and 1 Native Hawaiian. Something wrong with that picture. So it's wonderful that we talk about, you know, the growing influence of Hispanics, whether or not they're swing voters, whether or not they're going to make a difference in California and Texas because of their increasing population. And what about the African Americans, 54% of whom reside from Richmond, Virginia, down to Houston, Texas? Why haven't we elected more African Americans to the United States Senate and more Hispanics as governors? Why? Well, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how we can do it, how we can change the dynamics, and not talk about what divides us, but what brings us together. The long struggle that as African Americans and Hispanics have labored in this country, it's time that we began to get a big piece of the pie and not just the crumbs from the political marketplace. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. I'm tired of getting crumbs, by the way. We have to get crumbs in politics, and then we're told as African Americans and Hispanics that, you know, perhaps, maybe, but what? But it's not the time. It's not the time for Bill Richardson to become governor of New Mexico. It's not the time for Carl McCall to be governor of New York. It's not the time for Ron Kirk to be the senator from Texas, or Gloria Tristani to be the senator from New Mexico. No, the time is now. And we can make it happen because African Americans and Latinos have worked together historically to elect not only African Americans to positions of power, but also Hispanics. You know, there wouldn't be a Harold Washington without blacks and Latinos working together. There wouldn't be a David Dinkins or a Henry Cisneros or the Federico Pena or Wellington Webb. And let me just tell you, in 2001, I'm going to take my pen out so I can get a little funky with y'all. There wouldn't be a Shirley Franklin in Atlanta or Ed Garza in San Antonio if it wasn't for black and Hispanics. So while we all know about the problems, we know in Los Angeles there was some tension, some fighting, some bad politicking. And by the way, one of those individuals in the African American community who led the campaign for Hahn is now trying to lead the campaign to recall him. Why? Because he wanted to remove an African American as police chief. Okay? So we heard about the problems in New York City with Freddie Farrar, okay, and Mark Rainey. But let me tell you something. It was African Americans and Latinos who stood together and said, you know what? If the Democratic Party won't help us out, then perhaps some of us will stay home. And for the Hispanics, luckily to Mike Bloomberg credit, who by the way is a Democrat, who turned over because the line was short again. But it was Hispanics who gave him 25% of their vote and African Americans who gave them 18% of their votes. And yes, there were problems in Houston last year when Lee Brown and Orlando Sanchez fought against each other. So yeah, we will take three and say, okay, we had problems in 3 cities last year. But look at the 39 cities that Americans worked together, African Americans and the Black-Brown Coalition came together. And we were able to not only defeat the odds, but put really qualified individuals who are now in the pipeline when they leave City Hall to run for statewide office. But that's where the big issue comes in this politics that we're talking about. We got to now think about how can we put African Americans and Latinos in state houses. That's where all the decisions are being made. When they cut $1 billion from the budget, who do you think get cut first? The people who got to the table last. That's why we should be in the state houses. And by the way, who knows how to balance budgets better than black people and Hispanics? Because we only rich people take us into deficits. We all know that. Hell, poor people and blacks and Latinos, we know how to live within our means. And let me ask you another question. Who better know how to defend the country and fight against terror than those who have to ride on the highways and get stopped and pulled over by people with guns? Huh? It's blacks and Latinos. And so we can fight, and we care about public schools. Because after all, we get the schools without the books, we get the schools without the teachers, we get the schools where the chalks, we don't even have chalk, okay? We know how to defend public schools and make public education the best because it's our kids who go to those schools. So we can run, but in order for us to win, we have to work together. We got to take those numbers that, Matt, and thank you for telling us, we got to take those, and Xavier, take those numbers and turn them into real power and get your place at the table. And on that note, before I end, I'm going to just tell y'all one thing. If y'all want to do something, you know, I came up here for one reason. I want y'all to call your congressperson tomorrow, 202-224-3121, www.house.gov, and you tell them to vote for campaign finance reform. Unless we level the playing field and make it more accountable, then it will be green. And I ain't talking about NADA, because NADA, later with NADA. I'm talking about green. I'm talking about the dollars. That will keep African Americans and Hispanics from reaching their true aspirations. We've fought for this country. We've defended this country. We have shed our blood in disproportionate numbers for this country. And it's now time that we take seats of power in this country in proportion to our numbers in the population. And no more crumbs, my friends. No more scraps. Let's get a big piece of the pie, and so Matt can come back and be Democratic.
Like that?
Now, had they allowed me to stand, I would have told y'all that when justice rolled down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream, I would have given y'all that speech. But I had to give y'all my sit-down version of my talk.
People say amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lionel, you can preach too if you want to.
I'll take questions first.
Our next panelist was the man responsible for crafting President Bush's outreach toward the Hispanic community during the 2000 campaign. He's got a successful background in advertising. He uses his knowledge and skills, has used his knowledge and skills for President Bush, as well as 5 other Republican presidential campaigns since 1980. Along with his wife, Kathy, Lionel heads Garcia LKS, the largest independent Hispanic advertising agency in the Southwest. He has also founded Sosa Bromley Aguilar and Associates, now Bromley Communications, the largest Hispanic advertising agency in the U.S. He was named one of the 100 most influential Hispanics in the U.S. by Hispanic Business Magazine. He's the author, most recently, of The Americano Dream, How Latinos Can Achieve Success in Business and in Life. And like Donna, he was a fellow here last spring. So Lionel, welcome back.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Appreciate it. Damn, everybody hates to be after Donna. I'll tell you, if I ever were to stand up, I can't even come close to what she can do sitting down. But what I'd like to go over is, in about 5 minutes, I guess in 30 seconds each, going over 10, I guess, misperceptions or stereotypes of Hispanics, of voting Hispanics in the U.S. And I have seen the changes occur. At one time, all of these misperceptions were true, but in the last 5 years, a lot of changes have really been taking place. Number one is, yeah, the Hispanic vote is really, really getting big, but it hasn't made a big difference yet. The fact is that George W. Bush got 6,000 more Hispanic votes in Florida than Al Gore did, and if it hadn't been for those 6,000 Hispanic votes, that thing in Florida would have never even happened. Gore would have taken the state by about 5,500 votes. Myth number 2, Hispanics are Democrats. Well, not anymore. Less than half Hispanics say that they're Democrats. Between 25 and 30%, depending on the region, will say they're Republicans, and another 25 to 30% will say that they're independent voters. Myth number 3, Hispanics still prefer or see Democrats as their leader. Well, it's really interesting in terms of the approval ratings that the president has. They're even higher than mainstream America among the Hispanic. The president enjoys an 84 overall percentage approval among Hispanics, and one poll even showed an approval rating of 94% of Hispanic women approving of the president. Even 70% of Hispanics in California approve of the job the president is doing, and 90% of Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico approve of the job that the president is doing. Those are pretty amazing numbers, and the fact that they're bigger than the general population, I think, is a brand new revelation. Myth number 4, Hispanics will not support Republicans even if they are also Hispanic. Well, Orlando Sanchez, who ran for mayor of Houston, a Cuban Republican, got 74% of the Hispanic vote. 74% of the Hispanic vote. Myth number 5, Hispanics will not elect Republican Anglos, will not elect Republican Anglos. The fact is that Bloomberg Yes, he was a Democrat, but he also saw the light, is he got 50% of the Hispanic vote in New York, 50% of the Hispanic vote in New York. Myth number 6, Hispanics favor Spanish over English. Polls all over the place show that 94% of Hispanics believe that English is vital. Want to retain Spanish, but believe that English is the language of this country and want to retain it and feel that it is vital. Myth number 7, Hispanics don't really acculturate. They kind of see themselves as different and separate. Well, things are changing there too. In a recent poll, in fact about 30 days ago, 64% of Puerto Ricans on the island favor statehood over independence. Something very interesting happened after September the 11th in Puerto Rico. It was that Puerto Ricanos began to feel much more American than ever before. And if a referendum were to be held today, statehood would win overwhelmingly. Another fact, the Bush message appeal, a very conservative message appeal of opportunity, of inclusion, of a better life for the children, of personal responsibility, of the fulfillment of the American dream, very, very conservative type of messages really resonate with Latinos. Latinos are really tired of hearing them being portrayed as victims, as minorities who are victims in need of government aid. Hispanics are very, very much like any other immigrant in the U.S. here for the fulfillment of the American dream. Another fact is that Tony Sanchez, who is a Democrat running for governor in Texas and running one hell of a good campaign, I might add, it could be that our governor might be really close by the time that November comes. But he's running a very, very Republican type of campaign, and he's talking about opportunity and responsibility and the fulfillment of the American dream. It's almost as if he has taken George W. Bush's commercial and plugged himself right in there. And I'll tell you what, it's working, because it is a conservative message that really resonates with Latinos. Myth number 8, Anglos will not elect Hispanics. Well, that's changing too. As Hispanics are becoming, and African Americans are becoming a bigger and more important part of America, Anglos are also seeing a much more together total population, where the mayors of San Antonio and Austin were elected, yeah, by the support of Latinos, but if it had not been for the Anglo vote as well, they would not have been elected. Congressman Bonilla enjoys a wonderful, wonderful support of the Anglo community, and Abel Maldonado in California, that is in an area that is 65% Anglo and 65% Democrat, continues to win by 65% of the vote as a Republican. Myth number 9, Hispanics will not hold major elective offices anytime soon. Well, it's going to happen, and it came mighty close. Villaraigosa almost made it in Los Angeles. Orlando Sanchez almost made it in Houston. Ferrer almost made it in New York. And this is kind of, we're a preview of the things that will be happening. In 2002 and 2004, in just the very few short 5 years, half of a decade from now, we're going to begin to see many, many more Latinos and African Americans elected to public office by Latinos and African Americans, but by Anglos as well. Myth number 10, finally, really, and I hear this a lot, well, maybe President Bush gets it, but very few other Republicans get it. They're not really understanding the importance of the Hispanic vote. But I can tell you that Reardon, who is running for governor in California, has a very, very strong Hispanic campaign. Jeb Bush, of course, in California, Governor Perry, and the people who are running for Lieutenant Governor of Texas, David Dewhurst, and John Cornyn, who is running for U.S. Senator, all have strong, strong Hispanic campaigns, as well as the Republican National Committee, the Republican Senatorial Committee, and the Republican Congressional Committee. I think it's something that everybody is seeing, hey, this is not something that's just numbers out there. It is a reality, and a reality needed for survival. And both parties understand that, and they're both reaching out, and I'm so glad of it, because it really is good for Latinos and for African Americans, and we will be participating more. There'll be more opportunity for our people, and we will be able to participate in the American mainstream as never before.
Thanks, Elena, very much. It's my pleasure, lastly, to introduce my colleague, Professor Lani Guenir. Lani joined the faculty of the Harvard Law School in July 1998. She became the first black woman ever tenured by the Harvard Law School.
And still the only.
We're not clapping because it's good news, by the way.
Okay, good.
We're very proud of you. Prior to coming to Harvard, Professor Guenir was a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania for 10 years. She has written many articles and op-ed pieces and is the author of 4 books: The Tyranny of the Majority, Becoming Gentlemen, Lift Every Voice, subtitled Turning a Civil Rights Setback into a New Vision of Social Justice, and most recently, The Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, Transforming Democracy. She's become one of the nation's most sought-after speakers on issues of race and gender and political voice. Lani Guenir, welcome.
Thank you. I would like to talk about the soft bigotry of low expectations. That is obviously not an original phrase, but I think it applies to the discussion that we have been having thus far about the possibilities of Black Latino coalitions. And what I mean is that in many ways, what Donna Brazile started to talk about is something that I would like to continue. She said, we need to think about where we have come since 1776. And I would like to take us back to 1776 and ask why a democratic system that was put into place by a group of all male, mainly wealthy, often aristocratic men who own slaves should be the definition of the best democracy can offer. Okay? We are operating within a system that is incredibly elitist from its origins. And part of the problem with the discussion of Black Latino politics is that many of us, if we work just within the construct of what that democratic system is that these men put in place, then we are left with very low expectations of what we can do for all of the people of the United States, not just blacks, not just Latinos, not just Asian Americans, but working class, whites, and also women. And the reason I say that is because the most we can do is look for a strategy of Black or Latino faces in high places. And that is a strategy, in my opinion, of robust tokenism. Again, not an original phrase. I agree very much with what Donna has said, that we certainly want to see integrated legislatures, we want to see integrated state houses, and we would like to see integration at the highest level of the United States president and vice president. But what I am more interested in is talking about bringing Black and Latino people together to claim their true power, and their true power is not just in electing other members of their community to go off and become very important people. True power is really about mobilizing people at the grassroots so that they can have a voice in the decisions that affect all of their lives. So the claim that I'm trying to make is that we need to study and look closely at the experience of blacks and Latinos, because they can tell us an awful lot about what is wrong, not just with their exclusion, but what is wrong with the entire system of politics in the United States that disenfranchises on some level all of us, and I mean all of us. Now, when I say it disenfranchises us, the United States ranks on a scale of 200 countries that claim that they are democracies. We are down in the lower quartile in terms of voter participation. We have fewer people voting in this country than most other democracies. That is not an accident. We have fewer people voting in this country because we have a system that was put into place to make sure people don't want to vote. We have a system that was put into place that initially disenfranchised most of the people in the United States. Not just the African slaves, not just women, but most white people were also disenfranchised when this country started. So we need to think about dreaming. I'm right there with Donna Brazile wanting to dream, but to dream not just about getting a few more of us to have a piece of a rancid pie. We need to dream about changing what is in the pie, and then having enough so that all of us are not just eating pie, right, or cake, right? We need to have a decent, a decent nutrition that will enable us to survive and thrive. Okay, now, I just want to end with a comment about the miner's canary and why I think that metaphor is appropriate for this notion of the soft bigotry of low expectations. And I want to also acknowledge that the miner's canary metaphor did not come from me. It came to me from Gerald Torres, who is also my co-author. Unfortunately, I often collaborate with people and they never get credit. Not only do they not get the credit, they don't get the blame, but in this case, I want to share the credit with Gerald Torres, who's a professor at the University of Texas. And he got it from Felix Cohen, who was talking about Native Americans. And the idea is that those people who have been excluded, those people who have been underrepresented, those people who have been left out are like the canary in the mines. The miners used to take a canary to alert them when the atmosphere in the mines was too toxic for the canary to stay, for the miners to stay. And the canary's more fragile respiratory system would give way, signaling that there was a problem with the atmosphere in the mines. And the argument that we make in this book, and the argument that I would like to pursue with you during the questions and answers, is how the experience of blacks and Latinos are in fact the miner's canary in American politics. How what is happening to blacks and Latinos. The fact that what Donna said, that of 1,867 people who were elected to the United States Senate since 1776, only 15 were African American. That level of exclusion, that is a signal not just of a problem located in the canary, that is a signal not just about racism or even sexism. That is a signal that the way in which we have arranged politics in this country means that 24% of the people in this country control 60% of the seats in the United States Senate. 24% of the people in this country control 60% of the seats in the United States Senate. That is disproportionate power being given to a minority of people. We need to talk about really big dreams so that we can bring power back to the people and not to incumbent politicians, I don't care what their race or their gender.
Thank you, Lani, very much. We're all eager to get into conversation with you. We're going to take questions. Here's how we're going to do this. We've got 4 microphones, 2 here on the first floor, 2 up on the landings there. I want to ask that you identify yourselves. Step on forward, anybody that wants to ask a question. Identify yourselves. Direct questions, if you can, to a specific panelist. This being a panel of organizers and people who believe in voice. If the spirit moves you, comments are great too. Challenges are welcome, but please let the spirit move you briefly. If you have a problem with brevity, I will help you. Please don't be offended. We've asked the panelists for their part, to keep their answers as close to 2 minutes as they can, just so we can get a lot of questions out. And why don't we start over here, and then I'll come around.
My name is Felipe Perez. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And my question is directed to Donna and Leonel, and it's in regards to the mayoral primary in New York City. I was there, and what I saw happen is I saw Fernando Ferrer put out a message saying that I am here running for mayor because I want to represent the other New York. And in doing so, he was attacked on all sides as being divisive, as playing the race card, as injecting something inappropriate into the campaign. What I saw is a person of color being stripped of their status as a person of color, or he needed to strip himself of that in order to run. And it's frightening, because in raising the issues of the community he was there to represent, he lost that primary. Don and Leonel, how do you respond to that? What do we do?
Well, you know, it's difficult not just in mayoral races, but also in statewide races for African American and Latino candidates to refer to their race or ethnic heritage. I mean, they tend to fare better when they refer to themselves as, you know, Americans that want to bring all people together. I mean, that is just one of the barriers and the problems that I find that African American and Latinos face. Whenever they discuss race, they get penalized, and it get turned against them, and they're called or quoted or said that they're the racist, they're the one who's playing the race card and dividing people. It was very unfortunate, but that's something that I try to advise candidates, especially African Americans, Latinos, once they, you know, try to run in statewide or even in some of the municipal races. I say, look, the one thing you can't refer to and talk to them, and don't do a Tom Bradley and don't talk about your race or heritage, but you can do it in such a way that you don't really antagonize whites and cause mainstream media to label you as a divisive candidate, and then, you know, set you apart from your opponent on that issue. And then, of course, that drives up your negative, and that hurts your ability to get mainstream and sometimes often progressive whites to come on board. It's all over. And God forbid, I'm going to just say this because I'm going to say something and I'll go back to Washington tomorrow. And for African Americans and Hispanics, I mean, I don't know if you've seen this across the country, but one little minor mistake, one little peck on their little lapel pin, and it get blown out of proportion, and all of a sudden they're unqualified to serve. It could be something as trivial as, you know, that they forgot to include their middle initial on some tax form that they sent out, and then all of a sudden they're seen as a thief, a tax chief. Or it could be something major that, you know, sometimes majority candidates don't get as much news play and the like. So it's very dicey out there on the political playing field for African Americans and Latinos to run. And the one subject that's very difficult for them to navigate and get away with is race.
But if you can't run as a black or Latino person, what's the point of running as a black or Latino person?
Well, you run as an education candidate, you run as a candidate who's going to fix schools, that's going to clean up the streets, and you run on the issues, because issues are what ties people together regardless of their race. And that's my advice. I'm sorry, you can't do it unless you're in a very big majority-minority district. Otherwise, I would advise candidates not to do it. The penalties are too great.
They are, and I do believe any candidate that gets out there has got to represent everybody. I think that Ferrer, it's very obvious that he was Latino. That doesn't have to overdo it. You know, people know who you are. But I think that he was getting very, you know, he was coming up in the polls. And really, I think his defeat was more by the fact that Green came in, his opponent in the Democratic primary, and really made a big deal of it. So what happened is that he saw that Ferrer was doing very, very well and decided to kind of turn that against him and make a big deal out of the race issue, which really was what made Puerto Ricans get turned off either Green when he won the primary and go to Bloomberg, and that's why Bloomberg got 50% of the Latino vote.
I agree.
Could I just say something, even though that question was not directed to me?
Sorry.
No, I have no quarrel with you. My quarrel is what my fellow panelists have been saying. I feel very troubled by the notion that in order for somebody to be an effective spokesperson or representative, that they somehow have to whiten themselves or become something other than they are in order to get elected. That's part of the critique I'm making of electoral politics. And indeed, knowing about Farrar's campaign, he didn't say he wants to only represent blacks and Latinos. He said he wanted to represent the other New York, which was the New York of people who don't live in Manhattan, who live in the Bronx, who live in Queens, who live in Staten Island, who live in Brooklyn, not all of whom are black or Latino, but all of whom have been ignored or had been ignored, in his view, under the Giuliani administration. So he was basically saying he wanted to represent a coalition of poor and working class people. And it was the media and it was his Democratic opponent, his Democratic rival, who then played the race card against him. So I just think the facts need to be put out on the table, that in some ways he was made vulnerable because he was making a claim that is unorthodox in our political system, which is he's going to represent poor people.
Thanks, Lani. Let's go over here.
My name is Marcela Prieto. I'm a student at the college. And this question is directed to Mr. Dodd and Mr. Garcia. Mr. Dodd, you were talking about how Hispanics are the new swing group, but we've often been characterized as part of the Democratic Party. And I was wondering if you could explain what the Republican Party has to offer to Hispanics, because we have the votes and the new votes to give, but I was wondering exactly what the Republican Party can offer us. And if we're to become increasingly Republican, does that not also require the re-education of the Republican Party, who has traditionally been seen as excluding minorities?
So Matthew, what are you all selling today?
Well, you think selling's an interesting word, since I mean, if you go back, I'm going to check the last question first. I just got to go back in time and think, well, which party passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? What party? Wait. How many years did African Americans and Hispanics, primarily African Americans, support Republican candidates versus how many years they've supported Democratic candidates? 90 to 30. 90 years to 30 years. That's so the Republican Party.
Well, how many years could African Americans even vote?
And how did they get the right to vote? Over the veto of Democratic politicians.
And who signed the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah,
Okay, the voting right, that's an interesting thing.
Lyndon Johnson, August 6, 1965. Fact hard.
okay. But who organized to pass the Voting Rights Act? That's, I think, a more important question. That Voting Rights Act was not Lyndon Johnson's or any Republican. That was poor and working class black people with very courageous white people who joined them to demonstrate that people believe in freedom in this country. It's not about politicians, it's about the people.
Well, we're going to debate up here. I think the Republican Party, to be honest, I think the Republican Party has a great message to talk to minorities, especially Latinos, who are more conservative, put a higher premium on values that the Republican Party has talked about over the last 30 years. It's why the Republican Party has gone from getting 15% of the Latino vote to 35% of the Latino vote, and it's going to only grow. They talk about education, they talk about local control, they talk about accountability, they talk about returning money back to the voters, they talk about all those things, which if you go through and do any kind of polling or any kind of analysis of where Latinos stand on those issues, invariably they side with the Republican almost on every single issue. And that's why over the years they've continued to vote more and more Republican as they get exposed to Republicans who talk to Latinos. Now, Lionel pointed out made an interesting point. Are other Republican candidates doing that as much as they should? No, they're not. They're not doing it. The same reason why Democratic candidates don't often talk in general elections to African American voters. How often do you see a Democratic campaign organized by message, not grassroots, where they can go turn out the vote, but on message to strictly go at African American voters. You don't see it very often because they're worried about what that man raised over there. They're worried about they're going to be perceived as too left of center or whatever else it is, so they have a message that's almost purely organized for white swing voters. That's the way the general elections are run up until now, I think, which is why I think it's so important that Latinos now are the new swing group, because it's the first time any group that's been a pure swing group has not been white. And what that means is Republicans, Democrats, whoever else it is going to start having to talk their language, figure out where they stand, what issues are important to them, all of those sorts of things that they're going to now communicate. Can the Republican Party do a better job? Yeah. Is the President been trying to do this for the last 7 years as he's held office? Yeah, that's why he's been very successful. They do well. Again, Republicans are invariably, when you go through the issues with Latinos side with them. But there is a tradition, like there was a tradition with European immigrants that voted Democratic. That will change.
Matthew, as you look ahead, though, what distinction would you draw between a Republican rhetorical strategy aimed to appeal to Latinos and constructing a substantive agenda that speaks to Latino needs, Latino opportunities?
I don't know.
In other words, it's one thing to have a message, for example, on family values, which is well known to appeal to, or in today's lingo, to resonate with Latinos because of the importance of family in the culture in so many ways. It's another to construct a substantive agenda. Well, as you look ahead.
Well, I think that's, I mean, just speaking from the president's perspective on what his agenda has been for the last year, he passed an education bill that was supported by the vast majority of the public, especially Anglos, which education is the #1 issue among Latinos. Education is. He passed a bill with bipartisan support that returned local control, that can bring more accountability, it's going to have testing, it's going to do all those things, a substantive issue. Mm-hmm. He's focused on rebuilding defense and the military, which is totally supported by the Latino population. He is, no matter what sort of people say, Latinos support a low-tax state, a low-tax system of government where there's lower taxes with more efficient services. Latinos support that. So, I mean, you go through, it's not just a question of talking the talk, right. It's a question of walking the walk and doing the things he's done, which is why, which I said at the beginning, why the president as governor went from getting 24% of the Latino population and then passing a education bill at the state level that was similar to the federal level, that passed tax cuts in this state, and it's why we went from 24% of the Latino population to 48% of the Latino population.
Well, and here's a budget where the president said he would leave no child behind, but if you look at his 2003 budget proposal, he would leave many African American and Latino children behind. He will leave them at school with nobody to help monitor them because he's cut that program, the after-school program. He has cut the program that would ensure that our schools are drug-free and safe. And he's cut many other important educational programs. So while the photo op with Ted Kennedy looked good on TV, I shouldn't talk about photo ops, I know, because I talked about they like to take pictures but won't feed people of color. But true, you know, here's a president that gives you wonderful rhetoric and blur the issue lines, but when it comes to delivery, when it comes to really putting forward the programs to help our communities come out of poverty into the mainstream, his budget leaves a lot of people behind. And you talk about the light, well, the only lights that we'll see are the lights being cut off if we allow this budget to go through.
Well, I know we're going to have questions. I'm going to answer that question. I think it's unfortunate that we get in a situation where that leadership of the Democratic Party primarily bases the decision on a budget level on what they think is the most appropriate thing for whatever minority group it is that they think is the most appropriate thing, and therefore if somebody's against that program that they necessarily think is the right program, therefore they're anti-minority or anti that interest group. It's not, and I'm not saying that there's not strategies that the Democrats have that aren't, that, you know, they don't believe in their heart is the right thing, But to be honest, there are strategies, and there are issues, and there are things that Republicans believe in their heart. It's not just, I'm going to pass a bill, and boy, did we screw minorities today, and isn't that, a wonderful thing because they happen to be Democrats. They might actually have a program or a plan that isn't the same old thing that hasn't worked for 100 years, that we still have high poverty levels, that we still funded whatever we funded, that we still do whatever we do. Maybe there's a different way to look at things, and not to say Democrats are wrong, but maybe the Republicans have a plan that might actually work.
All right, we're gonna keep going here. I want to turn up here to the.
Hi, I think this question is...
Can you give us your name?
Oh, my name's Maria, and I'm at the education school here. I think this question is specifically for Donna and Lani, but anyone else can answer. I wanted to know from your perspective what you thought would be future social and political issues that could unite both the Latino and Black community, and specifically around strategies for change that touch on class and racial inequalities, and thinking specifically about the challenges around that. And I think specifically divide and conquer strategies, and I think California around bilingual education served as a case study where the perception is that that specific program only benefits Latinos and caused a great division between Black and the Latino community. Although education, I think, for both communities is an important issue. So I wanted to see what you thought in terms of what are the issues that could unite both communities and strategies for change.
Is that okay? Thank you. Donna?
I know Jim McGreevey in his race to become governor of New Jersey ran on a simple platform that united not only the African American and Latino communities, but all of New Jersey, where he ran on strong schools. He also ran to make sure that he was against concealed weapons. He also ran on what I call a lot of bread and butter issues that both the Hispanic and Latino community really rallied in support of. So I think there are many issues that the communities worked. I mean, we, both Hispanic and Latinos are against discrimination. That's why in California they rallied together to try to defeat Prop 187 to deny benefits to undocumented workers. They also rallied together to save affirmative action, and they were against Prop 209, and they rallied together to support bilingual education and against Prop 227. So whether it's racial profiling, whether it's bread and butter issues, whether it's basic issues of the role of government that enhance our ability to be free citizens in this society, African and Latinos can really come together around some basic issues.
Lani?
Yeah, I want to respond particularly to the theme in your question of social change strategies. And I just want to take a few minutes to tell you briefly a story about the Texas 10% plan, which shows George Bush in some ways at his best. This was a plan that was not, however, originated or created by George Bush. It was a plan that Black and Latino activists, professors, lawyers, and legislators put together after the Fifth Circuit ruled that the University of Texas could not use affirmative action to admit its students because affirmative action was unconstitutional according to the Fifth Circuit. This group of Blacks and Latinos worked together to discover that the real problem in getting people of color into the University of Texas, the two flagship schools, was the use of these SATs and ACTs and other tests that had a disparate impact on Latinos and Blacks. They also found that grades in high school were a better predictor of success in college than those tests that were keeping Blacks and Latinos out. Further, they found that those tests correlate not just with race, but with class. The more money your parents make, the higher your test scores. And they found that 75% of the students, the freshman class at the University of Texas in Austin, one of the two flagship schools, were coming from 10% of the 1,500 high schools in Texas. So 75% of the slots were coming from just 10% of the schools in Texas, and those were the schools that were dominated by affluent whites. They came up with a 10% plan that said anyone in the top 10% of their high school graduating class would automatically be eligible for admission to either Texas A&M or UT Austin. They came up with this plan, and it passed the Texas legislature by one vote. And that one vote came from a Republican who was white, who represented rural West Texas, and they were able to point out to this Republican legislator that no one in his district had been going to the University of Texas, Austin, or Texas A&M, because they were being kept out by these high-stakes testing, just as the blacks and Latinos were, that there was a class issue that was at stake. So they started with race because it was organized by blacks and Latinos who were conscious of the effect that the demise of affirmative action would have on their particular groups, but they moved from race to class. And Governor Bush signed this plan. Now, the plan has been in effect for 3 years, and lo and behold, all of the freshmen who've come in under the 10% plan have a higher freshman GPA than those who had been admitted before the Texas 10% plan, who had high SAT scores, but were coming from the 150 of the 1,500 schools in Texas. The group that has the highest persistence rate, that is the group that finishes freshman year and then comes back sophomore year and continues to excel, are black women. So part of what is happening here, and this is the story that I'm trying to tell, is that when you get people on the ground to organize, to have a voice in the social policy decisions that affect their lives, they are the ones who are going to come up with the most creative, most innovative plans, and the politicians will follow.
Amen.
Amen. All right. I agree with that.
I agree with that.
I agree with that.
I'm going to go up here next, as promised. Here's what we're going to do, though, to speed things up a little bit. I'm going to take several questions, okay? We're going to field them at one time, so let's go up here.
Hi, my name is Jimmy Gomez. I'm a first-year MPP at the Kennedy School. I'm also from Los Angeles, California. I worked for a LA City Council member. He wasn't a Latino council member. Everybody assumes that automatically. I was there during the election. I saw everything play out. I still talk to people in City Hall. There is a growing tensions within the African American and Latino communities. You can't really deny that. But I was just wondering, what can be done to kind of ease these tensions, have these two groups work together, and also how we could, it's not just black and Latino, it's black, Latino, Asian, and so forth. How could we create a multi-ethnic coalition that will basically change the face of this country?
Great, thank you. Let's go down here.
My name is Mipeo Kansande. I'm a student at the college. I was wondering, how would you prevent minority populations from being fooled by politicians who play to their votes around campaign time and then basically neglect them for the rest of the year? And also, not to put it so much on the people, but also on the politicians, how do you increase their accountability besides saying, oh, we just won't re-elect you, when you're wasting 2, 4, or 6 years where you could have been progressing and you might end up regressing because you took that risk that was unnecessary?
Thank you. Let's go over here.
Hello, my name is Philip Zipman. I'm a sophomore at Tufts University and a secretary of Tufts Republicans. My question is that it seems surprising to me that in 2002 we'd be talking about really, especially with a huge influx of new immigrants, of these old racial divisions, and how, how many people, this group has and how many people this group has, and what the strategies are for getting the most votes from this group. I'm wondering whether you see this as changing, whether the politician or the political structure is gonna try to address, especially the Republican Party, is gonna try to get the minority votes by playing the racial politics game up to date.
Playing the racial divide. Thank you. One more up here.
Good evening, and thank you. Christopher Tyson, first-year public policy master's at the Kennedy School. I want to talk less about the relationship of black and brown people to specific parties and more about their relationship to each other, because I think there's a lot of oversimplification there that needs to be worked out before any true coalitions can be formed. And a lot of it stems from some of the research that was pointed out at the top of the discussion. Assimilation works for Latino communities, and as class ascendance occurs in the Latino community, we see a movement to the right, we see an adoption of more conservative values, and there's a desire, as you expressed in your address, address to assimilate in the in the Latino community. The African American community, however, who spent the past 100 years, 150 years chasing assimilation with little or nothing to show for it, is starting to move away from that, and as evidenced by the movement for reparations, the questioning of the blind allegiance to the Democratic Party. So I want to understand, how do we deal with these issues of these minority communities in their relationship to whiteness and that access to the concept and the manifestation of whiteness in society, and how they can broker power? Because I don't think that this relationship is as easy or as logical as people are making it out to be.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to cut you off. You're making an important point. Lani, can I begin with you, and maybe we could bundle these just a little bit. We've got on the table the question about the relationship of folk of color to whites, and also a question about tensions among communities of color and what to do about that.
Well, and also the question about how do you create political accountability among politicians, and is racial politics just a game that is a tired old dead horse that people are bringing up to the fore?
You can bundle them all up if you want to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Lon.
But I'll take this last one first. I think that you're raising an important point, which has to do with the racism within the Latino community and the anti-immigrant nativism within the black community, right? We have to deal with both of those issues. In the Minus Canary, Gerald Torres and I talk about the racial bribe. And what we mean by the racial bribe is essentially an offer that is made or has been made to every immigrant group, and now is being made to Latinos, that they have a chance not to be black, not to be identified with blacks. They too can be white. Okay? So we have to deal with this. But on the other hand, part of what we're saying is you can't deal with these really tough questions in the context of electoral politics, because the stakes are very high, the media attention is very brief, they are only looking for your mistakes, they are not interested in the ways in which you can build from identity to interest to solidarity. They just want to know, how can we get a good story? So part of the challenge in terms of answering your question, and also to the young woman who said, what can we do to hold politicians accountable, is to work some of these things out outside of electoral politics. You've got to build strong grassroots organizations around issues of mutual concern and get people to understand the ways in which they can link their fate, not only to improve their individual position, their narrow self-interest, but how can they link their fate to make America better, right? Not just that they should have a share of the American dream. There's not enough of the American dream to go around. So if we're going to do just the American dream, somebody's going to be left out, and then the question is, who is it going to be? I think it's about really reframing the American dream, so we're talking about a system that is much more egalitarian, much more democratic, much more participatory, much more engaged. There are great examples of this happening in California. Californians for Justice, which organized around Proposition 209, involved coalitions among Latinos, among blacks, among Asians, and among whites. They didn't have enough funding, in part because of what the Clinton administration was doing at the time, which was trying to get re-election for Bill Clinton, not trying to save affirmative action. But nevertheless, this group of people, Californians for Justice, were able to mobilize and get strong support among even non-citizens who were willing to do work in the political realm, because they were told this is about really having a voice. Even if you can't vote, you can have a voice. And it's trying to organize people at the grassroots level that's going to build those kinds of strong coalitions. If you just organize it around electing a single politician, right, who is either black or Latino or Asian or something else, that one person can never speak for all of the nuances and complexities that we're talking about. So we've got to talk about a different kind of politics that's not candidate-centered but people-centered.
I agree.
Thank you. Is that all you want to say?
I'm not going to mess up a good thing.
All right.
I'm gonna add one thing.
Matthew, and then Leonel, if you want to. We haven't heard from you in a while.
And this is, for any press here, part of this is my own personal opinion, so it's not an opinion of the White House or the Republican Party, so I'll say that. I think one problem that's related to this that we haven't talked about is how polarized this country has become. And part of it, I think, has been contributed by what has happened over the last 50 years as regards redistricting. And I think what's happened is, this is my own opinion, is that we now have a system where people are now, and it's the farm team, the people that run statewide. So if you're going to run statewide, you need to get elected to be a state rep or a state senator or a congressperson, because that's real normally out of that group come the statewide. So it's reflected in who gets elected statewide. We now have a system where we carve out districts that in the House of Representatives, 180 seats are solidly Democratic and 180 seats are solidly Republican, so there never has to be a general election fight. There never has to be discussion about sort of issues that are, we got 180 that automatically get elected to the Republican Party and 180 that automatically get elected to the Democratic Party, and then we carve out Hispanic districts, and then we carve out African American districts, and then we carve out rich white guy districts in Houston, and then we carve out whatever else the kind of district is, so districts become completely homogeneous. And so when you have an Hispanic, he sort of grows into that district where the only thing he worries talking about is the 60% of the district that's now Hispanic and the 10% that's black, but when election turnout, 80% of the district's voters are Hispanic, and so what does he ever sort of talk to African American voters, and does he ever talk to white voters, poor white voters, whoever it is? A rich congressman in Houston, does he ever learn how to talk and what are the concerns are of an African American in Houston? Does he ever learn about the concerns or the abilities or whatever of a Hispanic voter in Houston? I think, and though this is sort of probably way off where sort of a lot of the party is, I think that polarization has not served minority politics well, but has not served the country well, because we now have a thing where one person's on one side, one person's on the other, and they never have to go back to the voters, because they're going to be elected for 20 years. They could do or basically say anything. The districts are locked in. It's an Incumbent Protection Act. They get this thing done, and then they go. And so now we're left with, you know how many swing districts are going to be in Congress this year? 35. 35 districts are swing out of 435. Why? Because of redistricting.
And so what's the solution? Proportional representation.
That came as a great surprise. Thank you.
You know, the other side to this polarization, I think, is that there is the opposite happening at the same time in terms of the way Americans are feeling about each other. You know, we see the student body here at Harvard being extremely diverse. And I think in Texas, for instance, we see that, is it not diverse? No?
You're seeing diversity here.
Yeah.
What's not diverse? Texas?
No, in Texas, there is a lot that needs to be done. There is absolutely no doubt about it. But you know what? It is to the benefit of the white population to be a partner in making sure that African Americans and Hispanics in Texas, in Florida, in New York, in New Jersey, in Illinois, in California do well, because poor populations are not good consumers. Poor populations are not heavy taxpayers. Poor populations have a higher incidence of welfare. Poor populations have more people in prisons and in jails. This is not good for the economy that everybody, particularly the Anglo, cares about. So it is a thing of all of us realizing that we must work together, and for all of us to understand that these higher expectations are needed, so that there is a high expectation for every black kid, for every Latino kid, for every Asian kid, and for every Anglo kid, that nobody is put in a box and say, okay, you're Latino, you come in with dark skin, and you come in looking poor, and you can never be a U.S. senator, or you can never be a governor, or you can never be a senator. So that these low expectations that are sometimes quite unconscious, so that they can be erased little by little. And we've always had divisions as human beings. We're tribal. We've always been tribal. We always kind of hold on to people that are most like us. That's just part of human nature. But the more that we grow and the more diverse that we are, the more we need to understand each other. And if we don't understand each other, we will be making a bigger effort to understand each other when we all know that it is to our own benefit.
I want to give the other three panelists, we've, I'm afraid, come to the end of our appointed time. I apologize to those of you that have been waiting. The other three might want to take a minute to wrap up. Any final remarks?
We're not going to let one more. Let's get one more from the people.
All right.
Not the powerful, as Lani has, I felt a little bit like the powerful a minute ago. Let's the people.
You felt like the elite?
I'm sorry, I
Be
didn't
as brief
realize
as you
I was
can,
last.
folks, but please.
This is about sort of techniques for how we can make our issues be the key issues in an election. And I was wondering if African Americans belong to both parties in large numbers where we can influence the primary elections. To what extent do you think that will force our issues to be the swing issues, if you will?
And Omar, preach, but be brief, please.
Working. The question that I have, I guess, is somewhat rhetorical because I'd like to ask you how Asian Americans in California have changed the dynamics of politics. I say this because for the first time, there are going to be the same number of Asian American state legislators as there are African American state legislators. And in districts that Asian Americans do not hold the majority. In fact, they're generally the minority. And so I think there's a conversation that is also happening that isn't represented at this sort of increasing pie. And I would just like to thank Professor Guenir for pushing on what exactly the pie we're looking at. And I feel that Asian Americans, particularly in California, if it's a bellwether of the country, need to be at the table.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last word, anybody, on these issues? Lani, can we start with you? Anything to?
Did you want to ask a question?
Oh,
is there? I didn't see.
This.
Thank you.
You want to jump in?
Very quickly, actually, I'll just ask
Trying
a
not to leave
shorter
anybody.
question. My name's Laura Manjarez. I'm a first year at the Kennedy School. Any predictions or people to watch out for in the next coming years for the Latino members? And also, if I get this in, I worked for a freshman representative from California who, and I was just wondering, how instrumental do you think organizations like the Congressional Hispanic Caucus or the Latino Caucus in California, how instrumental do you think they'll be in recruiting new talent? Do you think their role is essential or not?
I think they need to take a much bigger responsibility in identifying minority candidates, in nurturing them, and then supporting them with money. There's a lot of talk, hey, there's not enough of us out there, but I think that us as Latinos don't do nearly enough to find others like us, and we don't do enough to nurture them, and we don't do enough to support them financially. We kind of expect the others to do it for us. I think if we want to get further ahead, it's really going to be up to us to really wake up and do a lot of it on our own.
Let me just add in reference to your question. I started at the grassroots level, and I worked my way through the system. And like most people of color, and especially I used to tell people I had so many strikes against me, I didn't know what base was up. But I was born black, since that's what came out first. You would not know from this gray hair. And then I was born female. I'm born poor as dirt. I was listening to the other day when Senator Byrd and Mr. O'Neill was talking about who lived in a ditch and who had water, and I said, yeah, well, we had water, but damn, it was never high. And of course, in working through the system, I had to come through the system as a grassroots organizer. I had to come as someone who understood how to bring people together, where they live, where they work, where they eat, where they play, and where they pray. And so I had to learn how to organize, how to bring my people to the table as voters, as citizens in the political process. And at that point, when I was able, and as a young activist coming up after following the civil rights movement, bringing people to the table, then it was my turn to begin to run campaigns and to be a field organizer. And of course, I moved on and through the political process, and now, I'm seen as a strategist. That's what happens when you can't win the election that you win. You understand? So I think it's important. Well, Matt know I love him. Otherwise, I wouldn't sit between him and Lionel. And don't y'all ever tell nobody I was the sandwich in this, you know.
Look at this sandwich here.
Honey, it's every man's dream to sit where you're sitting. And don't you ever forget that. Well, at least I'll speak for myself.
I can touch that one.
But clearly, I would urge all of you to go back home this summer when you finish, as I urge, you know, the students last year. Don't think about, you know, those summer vacations where you go and get a suntan or go see who can drink the most beer or eat the most pretzels or the most peanuts, whatever. Go back into your communities and organize. Learn how to organize. Learn how to put people on the voter registration roll. Learn how to talk to people about the issues, about what's going on in their lives. And don't be afraid to go door to door and to get back and get your hands dirty, because I tell you one thing, the work of democracy may be hard, but I think the fruit of our labor, the harvest, when it finally comes, we will one day live out our true creed in this country. And I hope one day in my lifetime to work for the first African American, the first Latino, the first woman, or the first Asian American, the first anybody, but you know what, to be president of the United States. And that's my dream, and I hope you all will be there at the table to help me. At least I'm recruiting tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew and then Lani, last words.
I'm going to sort of speak to the question that was asked. Is I don't think it behooves any voter or any group in this country, and I know we're talking about minorities, but it extends far and beyond that, to be part of a system and a political place where you're automatically assumed that you're going to vote a certain way, automatically. And now there's people can make arguments of why one party's better on certain issues than the other and all that. But being in a system where you're automatically assumed that you're going to get 75, 80, 90% of the vote means, I believe, you're going to automatically be taken for granted. I believe that. I mean, I believe that with my heart. And it doesn't mean just African American voters. It doesn't mean just Hispanics or Asians or whatever. If you take part and are in a system where you only vote in the Democratic primary, or conversely, only vote in the Republican primary and a certain type of voters, you're never going to sort of be in the ability to sort of communicate broadly. So I think it behooves everybody to counteract this polarization that exists in this country, which I think has been a horrible development over the last 30 years. And I think it's only getting worse with the kind of cable shows and the diverse media that we have, and everybody sort of click, click, click until they get a viewpoint that confirms what they already believe, not a counter viewpoint. They find a channel or find a radio show or find whatever it is that agrees with them, and then they listen to it. And they never consider diverse interests or never consider diverse issues or never consider whatever. The other thing is the idea that sort of leadership or people can tell voting groups that they know what issue is important to them. Here's the list of issues that are important to them. Here's the African American issues. Here are the Hispanic issues, and it's X, Y, and Z. Because most of the time, they're not the issues they care about. Whether you're a Republican or Democrat, when I've heard leaders talk about it, it's not the education thing, it's some program or something they did or something that happened or whatever it is. It's a leadership issue. It's not necessarily a voter issue. So in closing, I think one, the more participation you can have in both parties, minorities can have in both parties, is going to benefit everybody, including currently white office holders, one. And two is don't necessarily assume that because some leadership says it's the right issue that the minorities care about, immigration, whatever the issue, is not necessarily what the voters or that members of those groups that actually sit in Houston or sit in Miami or wherever else they are care about. Most of the time it's not.
Lani.
Okay. I would just like to agree with something that Matt said earlier, which is the system is broken. Mm-hmm. He didn't actually say it in those words, but that's what he was telling you. He said that there were 180 seats that were controlled by Republicans permanently, 180 seats controlled by Democrats permanently, and then he said there are 35 swing districts, and after November, there'll probably be 4 or 5 swing districts, meaning as soon as those incumbents get elected, they will then permanently control those districts. What does that mean? That means that elections have already taken place even before the first voter cast a ballot. The elections took place when the politicians drew the lines that determined which voters would get a chance to vote for them. The politicians looked for their voters. The voters did not look for their politicians. That is a broken system. That is not about race. That is not about blacks and Latinos, although people like to talk about this as if this is a polarization that has developed recently because of race-conscious districting. Race-conscious districting is simply a neon light. It is drawing attention to a deeper problem, which is that we use winner-take-all single-member districts. The only countries in the world that use winner-take-all single-member districts are former colonies of Great Britain. So we need to throw off our legacy of colonialism and join the rest of the world's population that uses some form of proportional representation. When I'm talking about proportional representation, I am not talking about quotas. This has nothing to do with set-asides. This has to do with politicians earning their seats by getting out and mobilizing voters, not by sitting in a back room and drawing lines to capture voters by secret. South Africa, when it went to an all-race democracy in 1994, used proportional representation, and the white minority in South Africa, as a result, now has seats in the national legislature. Proportional representation simply says that any party or any politician only gets a share of the legislative seats proportionate to the number of voters who actually turn out and vote for that party or that person. So, for example, in Florida, in 2000, had they allocated electoral college votes proportionately, which they certainly could have done. There is nothing in the Constitution that says they had to give those electoral college votes winner take all to whoever got the most votes, even by 500 or whatever the number was. If they had used proportional representation, George Bush may have gotten 13 of the electoral college votes, but Al Gore would have gotten 12. That is a way of allocating power proportionate to the number of voters who came out and voted. What we do is we inflate the power of the winner, and then we give the loser nothing. And that's why it's so high stakes, because if you don't win, you get nothing. That is a system that is broken. That is a system that has discouraged people from participating. That's why we will not have 50% of our voters even voting in November.
Right.
So the system is broken.
I want to say
30
one
second.
Okay, third.
Ms. Joinder, and then
I'm going to say just one thing. I do think there is something wrong with a system that basically cuts up districts and it's done in a certain way. I don't necessarily think the solution to that is proportional representation. I think the solution to that is some sort of thing where people are not necessarily divided and cut and gerrymandered in such a way that they're fall in those districts. That's the first thing. The second thing, the point about the Electoral College in Florida, if we proportionally represented the Electoral College nationwide, George Bush would have got 281 electoral votes nationwide if we proportionally represented it by state nationwide, because he would have won 20 electoral votes in California when he lost 54. So if we did it even by congressional district and voted it by congressional district, who carried the George
Right,
Bush?
but I'm not talking about by congressional district, right? That's another technique to just bring us right back to a structure that is already divide and conquer. This is not about changing the way we district. All districting is gerrymandering.
I'm not even going to bring up fuzzy math. David.
Let me, if I could, let's give a great round of applause for this wonderful people. And Professor Briggs, you were wonderful this evening. We appreciate the way you moderated this panel, and we thank you. Did you have a closing word? I wanted to introduce some fine stars. We call them the Spring Stars. These are our 6 new fellows for this spring semester. And let me just very, very quickly show you who they are, point out who they are, and we invite you to attend their study groups or discussion groups, whichever you may care to call them. They're going to be Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons from 4 until 5:30 for the next several weeks. You are welcome to come in there and share your thinking with them and to learn from them and to give them your opinion on things. Callie Crossley is first. She is former producer of ABC News 2020, Emmy Award winner, Eyes on the Prize. We're all familiar with that. Her study group is going to be Behind the Media, Deconstructing the Message. Callie, you take a bow if you would. Would you stand up, please? Thank you. Sitting right here on the end is Bill Hilsman, media advisor to Paul Wellstone in the U.S. Senate, Governor Jesse Ventura, who appeared here 2 years ago, and also presidential candidate Ralph Nader, who we're going to try to get Bill to bring to this stage pretty soon. And New Politics for the New Millennium, Bill Hilsman. Thank you, Bill. And Juliana Glover Weiss, Press Secretary to Vice President Dick Cheney in the White House. The year in review, the Bush-Cheney White House. Juliana, we welcome you to the Institute of Politics. And right here is former governor, former United States Senator Charles Chuck Robb, the state of Virginia. Chuck Robb, would you please stand? His discussion group will be the politics of defending America. And for the first time in the 35-year history of the Institute of Politics, a husband and wife team, and what a dramatic team we have. Linda Bird Johnson Robb. Linda, would you please stand? Co-founder. Co-founder and chair emeritus of the Board of Directors, Reading is Fundamental. She's going to be doing her study group, When Politics is the Family Business. And who could speak better to it than that? A viewpoint of political life. And finally, Congressman Ron Masoli. He is here. He spent 24 years in the U.S. Congress from the state of Kentucky. He is the author of the Simpson-Masoli immigration bill. Ron Masoli is going to be talking to us about immigration policy and how the Congress works. Ron Masoli. Ron, we appreciate you. Did I miss anyone? Professor and our wonderful panel, we thank all of you, and you are so great to come. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.